Welcome to Super Connected with me, Tim Arnold, and my special guests. We invite you to join us in an intimate and honest exploration into the theme of connection. What it means to be connected to each other, what it means to be connected to ourselves, and what it means to connect in an ever-changing world. Peter Radcliffe, aka Phra Peter Suparo, is originally from London but grew up in Berkshire. After starting university life studying history, he discovered it was not for him and instead decided to drum for various musical outfits in the pop and jazz world of the late 1980s. By the 90s, he transitioned into rock, trip-hop and electronica. As the millennium loomed and dark-stoned angst became trendy, like every other fashion slave at that time, he started consuming drugs, which he subsequently discovered wasn't a good idea. Consequently, in 2002, as the result of an unlikely series of coincidences, Peter found himself at a detox facility in a Buddhist monastery in Thailand. Following a successful recovery, he remained there and was ordained as a monk. In 2007, Peter returned to the UK and to the music business, initially as a recording studio engineer and then drifted back into playing, but mostly as a percussionist, working with various people on a freelance basis, but settling into a regular steady gig with the revived Penguin Cafe Orchestra. Having enjoyed a positive foray into the music world again, Peter then decided that he'd had enough, and so he went back to Thailand and became a monk again. So, across the airwaves to a Buddhist monastery in central Thailand, I must cup my hands in prayer to welcome the first monk on this show, Phra Peter Suparo, my friend and collaborator, Mr. Peter Radcliffe. Peter, how are you?
Hello. I'm very well, thank you. Yes.
Very good. So thanks a lot for taking time out of the... I'd like our listeners to get an idea of where you are,
okay,
and actually what the life is there. I know I've obviously spent time living in the monastery that you're in, but really you should be the person to let our listeners know what it is and what it's like.
Well, just say what it is and what it's like. Well, we're in a bit of a unusual moment, a little sort of cusp, because we're winding down our normal monastery activities at the moment to go on Tudong, which is...
this is the pilgrimage, isn't it?
It is indeed. So Tudong is leaving the monastery, going wandering, which is a tradition of our order of monks who are from the forest monk tradition, who initially would probably have spent most of their time wandering and smaller amounts of their time in monasteries during the rain season. But these days the balance has shifted back the other way. So right now it's all just frantically packing kit to go and sit in the jungle, probably until the coronavirus thing is over.
And how is that affecting living in a monastery where obviously you're all together? There's over 100 monks and I think maybe up to 20 nuns in your sangha, in your community.
Yeah, a bit bigger than that at the moment, actually. About 150 to 40 monks to nuns, I think. Yeah, we're growing.
So you've not been put under any orders by the Thai government to observe social distancing or anything like that yet?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to a monk. I mean, self-isolating, social distancing, can't get out to work, that has hardly disrupted my day particularly.
Yes. You're there. You're quite a lot of the way there already, aren't you?
Yeah, and we tend to stay in the monastery unless there's an essential reason to go out from it. On the other hand, I mean, what's happening in Thailand, it's been a pretty slack and slow response from the government. And they're sort of starting to tell people to stay inside now, but it's been so sort of indecisive that people aren't taking it terribly seriously, especially out here in the sticks where we haven't really seen it happening yet.
Yeah.
But of course, that's the thing. If people wait till they see it happening, then oh yeah, perhaps I should. Then everyone's infected already. So
yeah. What from from a Buddhist perspective of yourself and the abbots, the high monks at the monastery. What's been said? What's been the message about what is happening at the moment to all of us all over the planet?
Well, I mean, I wish I could deliver you some sort of packaged statement. There hasn't been one about it. I mean, I think probably we'll be talking about this a lot when we get out on Tudong next week. There'll probably be some talk about that. I mean, right now it's just filtering through that everybody just scale down what you're doing and
yeah, so I guess whereas most of us are prone to panic, at the monastery, I mean, I know because I've spent a lot of time there. It's obviously you're in a good place for not sort of leaping to a state of panic, aren't you?
Well, I would hope so. On the one hand, I mean, as I said, the sensible measures. The first sensible measures to be taken are what we do anyway. But I mean, for another thing, I mean, in a way, it's I would never say there's anything good about this that's happening. But if there were, I mean, one thing that is often emphasized a lot by a lot of Buddhist teachers is to be continually aware of death, of things going wrong, of impermanence, and so something very that pushes it to the fore like this shouldn't really send us into a state of panic, as you say. People do a lot of trying to persuade themselves that this stuff doesn't exist, and never mind pandemics, that you could just be hit by a car crossing the street today. So we're supposed to be able to take this kind of thing in our stride, and it's it's to a certain extent it's business as usual. I mean, if you didn't have the coronavirus spreading all over the world, there'd still be a large numbers of people who are going to die today.
Yeah, I mean, let's just go over that. Obviously, your sort of position at the monastery, like everybody's, is quite unique. You've been, a musician and working in that crazy world in London. A lot of your life in the music industry, all the things that we think are permanent, all the craving and all the things we want, and then you've spent a significant amount of time as a monk in the monastery, and as a supervisor for foreigners visiting the monastery, and with me, presiding over the music of the abbot of the monastery, and and then you've come back into the music industry, and then gone and become a monk again. So I'd say you're fairly qualified to answer the question that so many people say, or even just to respond to that classic kind of, well, it's all right, to be calm and meditating and mindful if you're in a monastery. How do people do it? Those of us that I've just been rescued from London. I'm out in the country now.
Congratulations!
So I feel a little bit calmer anyway. But many people are not. Many people are in cities all huddled together and quite terrified of bumping into another person. And what's your thoughts on their way forward? And what might help?
Quite a broad question. I think I see what you're
Well,
driving
I
at.
only ask you in your capacity as somebody that's trodden both paths. You know what it's like to be able to be peaceful and in a monastery, and you know what it's like to be in a city like London as well.
Yeah, well, I had a bit of a chuckle when you, and I recognised so much when he said it's all right for you in a monastery.
Well, it's not. That's not me saying it, but
I know.
I've heard a lot of people with that.
No, not taking offence. Like I said, I recognise that. It's like, oh yeah, just get away from it all. Why don't you? Yeah, you're just hiding from life. Yeah, it's all right for you. You want to try the real world, but yeah, I have tried the real world, and I'm not sure that I actually give it that title, the real world. Of course, this is the real world. Anywhere you happen to be is the real world, and I think it would be very foolish to expect that just because you come to a monastery and take on a contemplative lifestyle that everything just becomes easy and fluffy. I mean, the one thing that becomes extremely apparent when you simplify life so much and remove so many of the external stresses is it's shocking how little that changes anything. That and so I think one experience that people have after a little bit of settling into a place like this, where at first it can be a bit honeymoonish and it's also wonderful and peaceful, and actually, again, you're just being affected by externals that are unfamiliar to you. Like, we can go and hear some people chanting, and we can go and look at some lovely mountains. And then it becomes normal to you, and you realize that your mind is just as full as the same sort of seething sewage as it ever was. It's just that previously you kept blaming it on other people. That you know, that you thought there were perfectly reasonable reasons why I'm so full of resentment, and it's you.
I want to try to. Yes, I'd like to try to just help people visualize a little bit further where you are. I mean, many people think of a Buddhist monastery as a sort of pristine temple, and where Peter is speaking from, the Thamkrabok Monastery, where I lived with him for a short while, and the monks is it's a sort of a nature park designed by the people that made Blade Runner, and within that there are beautiful temples that have been made, but it's a very earthy, down to earth, what I dare to say, and you can correct me if I'm being disrespectful, but it's quite a rock and roll punk DIY ethic towards Buddhism, in terms of these monks are, Peter included, working all the time to build for the community, and it's not just monks that live in the community, it is the followers and the lay people there, but it's pretty wild, and it's like an overgrown garden. It's not been trimmed and nipped and tucked. It's wild peace, I think, is what we get in Thamkrabok. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, probably it's worth pointing out, and you and I could very easily forget because we know what we're talking about. That there's probably more that needs to be explained. But it's worth pointing out that one thing one thinks of a monastery as being is ancient. It's been there for centuries. Well, this hasn't. We've got an official history. We were founded in 1958, and at that point there was nothing here at all. There was a cave. There's some smallish mountains. We call them mountains. They're rocky crags full of caves, and it was just, we mentioned Tudong earlier, wandering monks using the caves to shelter in, and then they decided to make a more permanent base, and so just started building at that point with ad hoc materials, just what they could find. And we've been doing that ever since. And so this place is still under construction. And, we mentioned the numbers of monks and nuns, that I surprised you with the fact that we're bigger now. We are growing, and so there's always stuff going on. There's a massive building site at the moment. It's right in the middle because we're finally finishing that huge standing Buddha. So yes, very busy, bustly, noisy at times, grubby, and so it's not sort of serene monks sort of drifting around it's a lot of activity.
It's very real, actually, isn't it? It's very real.
Yeah, it's real.
There's something else I'd love you to share and talk about, which is the last the abbot of the monastery who was there when I lived there.
Yeah.
Longpo Charan Panchan. He's a monk that really brought us together.
Yeah.
And he used to talk about parts of the monastery like a spaceship sometimes. I mean, he would, and, you know, like it was some sort of magical airport where souls met, and it was not at all like a strict and rigid a Buddhist sort of view of the world that he had. He was very I don't know, dare I say, mystical, clairvoyant even, and for many different reasons, I think you and I both agree, changed our lives in some way, shape or form.
Yeah.
And you know, sadly or not sadly, he's not with us in this form today. Mm-hmm. I really wondered what do you think he would say about what's happening in the world at the moment in terms of coronavirus, obviously posing this question for all individuals that we suddenly can't be close to each other. It's such a deep kind of existential crisis that it's posed to all of us, that you can save your life if you don't go near the people that you love, or you know, or just your fellow human beings. It's astonishingly I don't know, I wonder, what would a man like Longpo Charan Panchan think about this moment in history?
Oh, crikey. Well, it would be quite presumptuous of me to say what he'd say.
Well, you can only guess, but you was close to him as anyone there, so, you know.
Well, I mean, in terms of what he'd say, he was always reminding us that things weren't going to be permanent, that we keep trying to establish things and say this is how it's going to be, and we build on this and we move forward, and that whatever is happening politically, economically, or whatever is subject to change. I mean, but this thing that you brought up particularly, which is extraordinary, because you might think, you know, every time you visualize something that makes people think apocalyptically, not that I'm saying this is the end of the world, but it's, you know, you think, well, then we huddle together, don't we? And it's there is something very ironic in this. Yes, maybe you want to spend this time with your loved ones, but at a safe distance. And it struck me the other day, I think possibly since you mentioned the possibility of doing this, and obviously I've been communicating with a few other people, that everybody's huddling inside, cut off from the people immediately around them, but we're in this very hyper-connected world via the internet, where everyone's really keeping their eyes on what's happening globally.
Yes.
And it's a very strange space to be in, isn't it? Of being sort of...
Well, yeah, and that's been the primary reason that I wanted to do these shows, was before, obviously, the situation we're in now with the pandemic. I was just very heavily criticising my own use and all of our use of communication technology, I suppose, to umbrella the Skype and the FaceTime and the social media and the Twitter and the Facebook all under one umbrella, which is just ways to communicate with each other when we're not in the same room. It's the easiest way to explain it, isn't it?
Yes.
And I was my feeling was that it was not a constructive way to build relationships. It was not a constructive way to transition traditional relating to sudden online relating to people that you care about, and that there are huge problems with that. Now I'm not so sure, and now I'm really confused. So I'm glad that I've started a show about connection in the midst of having to question it the other way. Is that what would we all do without it? Indeed, you and I are communicating over the internet right now. So,
which I'm very grateful for. Yeah,
and me too. But as a monk, practicing detachment from things and people. Where does that leave us? We're meant to, if a path to a nirvana is achieved by detaching. Where does that leave us at the moment, where we're all desperate to really cling on to each other?
God, well, it is very interesting that you mentioned that you yourself have been very critical of what have been happening with the
because I'm a net addict.
Indeed, yeah. But not just you. I mean, it's been in the last couple of years. A lot of people have been saying, "Oh, the world's just going to hell because of social media," and blaming it for everything. And yes, certainly we've seen a lot of negative effects of people getting lost in the unreal world of it and losing the line between what's real and what's not. But I think maybe that's just the explosion in this technology has been so rapid that we haven't adjusted to it yet, and it is intriguing that suddenly it could play a very crucial role in getting through this thing well. And obviously this technology is neither good nor bad. It's what you do with it, like any technology, like knives, good or bad. They stab people. They also make lovely dinner, It's like, don't stab people. I'm against stabbing, but I'm for knives. Yes, that's fascinating. It's interesting to see whether this is going to change the way people are thinking about these things, using them in a more intelligent way.
Yeah, from where I'm standing, it's a bit. I feel like the last few years we've seen the worst of connecting via social media and just online in general, and now we are seeing the best. People are getting up in the morning and they can't go out for their run, so they're doing it indoors with somebody showing them on a screen.
Well, absolutely, and I realised. I mean,
some people were doing it before. Now they've got no choice.
Yes. I realised I didn't address one of the things you said earlier, which is just a sort of monk perspective on it. And indeed, I have really insulated quite a bit since coming back to be a monk again. I spent the first 6 months without any internet connection at all, and it was delightful. It was joyful. I hadn't quite planned to. I just hadn't got round to sorting out a decent phone yet, and then just realised how great it was, how lovely it was to not have this bleeping device demanding my attention all the time, and definitely seeing the positive effects of me having far more attention on where I was and what was happening. And if I did have to go and communicate with someone, to go and have to find a Wi-Fi spot and take my computer. And so that made sure that I was only going to do that if there was something meaningful that needed to be done. And I think that's the crucial thing is, certainly, funny enough, I had a conversation with another monk from another monastery on a bus some time ago, and he was... he'd been a monk for over 10 years. He was a very heavyweight meditator as well, very just a heavyweight in all kind of ways. And I remember he pulled out his phone because it bleeped, and he looked at it and he said to me, this is the enemy. This is my enemy, but I need it. People expect me to have this, and definitely.
So is it a calling? Is the tech that gets us and makes us anxious and makes us stressed and makes our eyeballs hurt because we're using it too much? Is it the ultimate test that's saying you have to find the middle way? It's everything that Buddhism and all the different strands is trying to teach us about. It's about balance, because you and a lot of the high monks at Thamkrabok all have mobile phones on you, don't you?
Yes, although as I said, I've done
but you're not all
serious stretches of time without it.
Because you're doing serious I don't what you'd call it, embodied work on yourselves and on your souls. So clearly these phones are not on all the time, but you will. So there's a sense that all of you in the monastery just know how we should all try to use our mobile phones.
Well, I mean, it is a huge challenge. As I said, this hugely experienced monk I was talking to was talking about the difficulty of relating to it properly. And one thing I've definitely noticed is, because we also, as well as just monking, do this work with addicts here, that we've seen a huge benefit in saying to people that they should surrender their phones and devices while they're in rehab and post-rehab, or just have a sort of set time for contacting the people you need to. Because when people have difficult things that they need to get to grips with in their lives, it's terribly attractive to get lost into this world which has sort of simulacra of activity, little things that arouse your curiosity and little things that give you a tiny endorphin boost, and that simulate all these kind of things that we need to be actually creating in reality. And of course, modern technology is a way to live. It can be used to facilitate living and meaningful stuff, but it can also be used to simulate that. I think there's quite a blur between gamer world and using this technology to facilitate real things.
Yes.
And I think definitely you see, I mean, one thing that's really changed, that's massively changed. I was first here in 2002, and so this technology wasn't here. You know, we had slow dial-up connections for the internet on computers in a particular
So you're
place.
making me you're reminding me of how I ended up at the monastery now. So just because it would seem a bit spurious not to, just to carry on and not mention how we met, because I'm obviously ended up being somebody that ended up bringing a fair bit of technology into that monastery, but for creative reasons. But yeah, so Peter is the first monk I met when I was in treatment for addiction, and that was just in 2003.
I think so, yeah.
I was surprised then, as some of our listeners might be now, to hear a broad South London accent speaking from the holy robes of a Buddhist monastery.
The holy robes.
And that was a time where I remember feeling conflicted about we brought in all the iMacs so that monks could use music, which you oversaw obviously in the recording of, what do we call that music? I mean, you'd call it liturgical, wouldn't you, if it was in a Christian monastery? I'm not sure.
I suppose you could. There isn't really a term for it, because it's not a traditional part of the
of any Buddhist monastery. Yeah.
No, it's so. That probably needs some explanation. So yeah, you came to deal with your thing, and then asked to stay and write your next album. So you brought in all this new hard disk based recording technology that was. You
were a monk then. Did you feel a bit like it was a bit dodgy of me just bringing all this like electric stuff and of software and programs?
I mean, it was certainly it was certainly odd and unexpected, and I probably was resistant to it. I definitely was. On the personal side of it, I suppose the counterpart of what you said, of just finding it quite strange to encounter somebody like you who'd come exactly almost from the world that I'd
escaped from.
Yes, and so I really sort of initially just didn't want anything to do with it at all. And
you mean the music industry and the kind of rock world and all of that?
Yes, and I suppose embodied in you,
Okay, staying with the music, you told me that one of your favourite songs is "Bullet in the Head" by Rage Against the Machine. What's your connection to that, Peter?
Well, serendipitous in this case. I mean, as I think I warned you when we were talking by email, I'm going to be a slightly cantankerous guest, not quite sticking to the plot and refusing in a very Buddhist
You're a monk.
way. I'm a monk.
There's nothing I can say. You're a monk. I mean,
I'm a
you
monk.
do whatever you feel.
I'm a man of the cloth. I am a reverend, if not a very reverend.
Yeah.
Somewhat reverend, I hope, at least. So yes, I mean, in just to get a bit technical here, in Buddhist terms, we're supposed to be really trying to actively reject any attempt to sort of build up a kind of super self that is connected to all kinds of things. This is a part of me. So I rolled with the fact that it had been in my head on that day when you got in touch and asked about this, and so there certainly was a connection. And a very palpable one, though I'm not saying it's an intrinsic one to understanding me, but the connection was actually via the cover art from the album, which is not just a cover art from the album, it's a news picture from 1963 of a Vietnamese monk on fire, and that had been in my mind a lot because of an article I was writing for some friends of mine about Buddhism, and that struck me as a very important image to bring into it, to emphasize the fact that here in Thailand, I'm writing for some Thai friends of mine, and we tend to think of Buddhism as something that kind of hip, unconventional people would be into, and obviously in Thailand it really isn't. This is the Church of England. And they're associating it very much with conformity. And so I thought I would just bring that in to show that there's a whole other side to it. But of course, in personal terms, it then occurred to me what an extraordinary, not only piece of music it was, but in terms of how it happened historically at the age that I was at, that I spent my teens during this desert of the 80s. When
and the Rage Against the Machine first album was, I think, early 90s, probably 92 or 93.
92, yeah.
92, right.
Yeah.
So
it was one of those albums that announced to me, and at that point, I had my head completely off in the alternative, weirdy-beardy world of music, of jazz and things from around the world and odd stuff, because I just thought the mainstream is just, it's over. The world belongs to Phil Collins and Madonna now. And and that was one of several albums as the 90s got underway that just said, okay, it's back. And it's...
Yes, and... Sorry, go on.
Well,
carry on.
Back in the sense of... the spirit of it and the sound of it. I mean, we're both musicians, and I can so distinctly remember having, always been a bit of a rocker, just thinking, I know what lead guitar solos sound like, and what is that man doing with that thing?
Yeah.
Just the creativity of it, the absolute rejection of any rules. That is absolutely not how you play a guitar.
It's Tom Morello, isn't it?
Tom
He's
Morello.
always been a hero of mine.
What a god that man is, yes. And of course, the whole band is excellent. It starts off with that lovely, bouncy kind of solo bass line. And they all give each other so much space in that you can hear what everybody is doing. Nobody in the band is subjugated to anything.
I think we're so lucky to have had those kind of bands in that period. I mean, it's a kind of it harks back to the late '60s kind of revolutionaries, doesn't he? I mean, Zach De La Rocha is he's a great leader in a way, and I think they've reformed recently. Did they not?
I wouldn't know.
I'm not entirely sure what it was for, but they reformed this year. It's funny to think those kind of songs now are, they represent to us, I guess, our youth. I was in my late teens. I guess would you have been in your early 20s when that song came out? Yeah. that was the sound of youth when we were young. Sound of youth is very different now. It's definitely not as much noise coming from electric guitars.
No.
I remember when we first met, and I was making lots of noise with electric guitars in the monastery.
Yeah.
and you came up very curiously figuring out what it was I was up to. Back in 2003, I think, wasn't it? And did you think, had you kind of renounced, I don't know what you call it, kind of
Satan and all his works.
Music. Say again, sorry.
Satan and all his works.
Satan and all his works, yeah, until I arrived in your life. What was it like, really turning to Buddhism in practice seriously and taking the precepts and observing that discipline every day of your life, and then having music attached to the commercial and the apparently permanent world come landing when you in your world? I mean, did you feel like the temptation to be in that world came back to you, or
the whiff of sulphur and brimstone? Well, I didn't like it one little bit, but I mean, not your music, the whole thing. But I think we touched on this earlier, that I think it highlighted to me that a decision to be a Buddhist, to be a monk, to live a certain way wasn't about the trappings. And now this thing has come up, this person has come to the monastery, and certainly when somebody asks to spend some time at the monastery and just do their thing, get themselves together, that's the thing that we do. The fact that you happen to be a musician from London meant that, of course, we can accommodate that, but it all just felt too strange and familiar, too strangely familiar to me. So I was certainly resistant, and I do remember going up to that room you were at, and it was I was sent up there. That what happened was that you'd had this conversation with Longpo via translation, via Mechi Rampai, and Longpo knew that I'd formerly been a musician, and I got this message, just say, well, we've said this guy can do his thing, and just out of curiosity, can you go and tell what the hell he's doing and whether he's any good? And so
I have a lot to thank you for.
well, I did give you, I won't say how many stars, but I did say no. He's certainly not an idiot kind of fantasist wasting everybody's time. He's actually doing something that he knows how to do, and it looks like it will be productive of something. And let's see where this goes. Personally, I mean, it was intriguing that something had happened in the history of technology at that point, that when I'd been in the monastery for a while, and before that I'd been in a bit of a kind of not very receptive space because I was taking a load of drugs. And just at that point, shortly after the millennium, I saw a guy with a laptop. I went, that's rubbish. It's like, what's he doing? House music? And when I stepped out of the music business, people were recording real audio. They're going, wow, you can put real audio on it. And I would listen to it and I go, yeah, but it's rubbish, isn't it? If you're doing serious music, you need a 2-inch tape machine. What the hell are you going to do with that? Yeah. And so I had this sort of seeing what you
recording on laptops means rubbish music.
Yeah, and it was exactly at that point, probably, within a year or two, that just the technology had just moved to the point where you could actually be doing serious stuff with music recorded with microphones.
Yes.
And so that struck me very like a bit of a bombshell, really.
I'd like to talk about listening with you, listening to music or listening to sound, which is, I think, certainly in the world I'm living in, with so much information being hurtled towards us all the time, all of us, are presented with so much stuff that there's very little time to listen to silence and to listen to space that isn't occupied with some kind of noise, sound.
Yeah.
As somebody that does that on purpose regularly, I mean, how many times a day do you meditate or try to meditate?
Oh, well, I mean, it varies. I mean, I'm probably, got a baseline of a couple of hours of meditation per day. It goes up and down. I'm about to go into an intensive period on Tudong, where it'll be a lot more than that.
And do you find it? What do you find silence does for you?
Well, silence is bloody noisy. I think
I like that. Silence is noisy.
I think we said something earlier about just the sort of getting away from it all in a monastery, and I mentioned that that what you will hear is that the internal noise is just expands to fill what you thought was flooding in from the outside.
Yes.
So in a microcosm, that is, I think, something that is very noticeably happens with meditation, and so. So it's essential to kind of see what we're superimposing on silence, because it's so rare that there are so many things to just fill your attention with, even when people think that they're just doing nothing and daydreaming, and something's going on as a background service, and then they can think that everything that they experience about how the world is and think is just conditioned by the way things are, as opposed to what you superimpose upon it. That sounds very theoretical. Just put very simply.
Yeah, but very. I like that. The idea,
right?
It gives me hope to think that I'm superimposing, my version of life onto the actual life.
Well, absolutely. I mean, something I've been getting very interested in recently, and let's say hurrah the internet as well, because I've educated myself about a number of things in the time while I've been here. And one thing I've become very fascinated by is the way things are developing in neuroscience and what they're finding out about the mind and perception, and how that lines up with things that Buddha said a long time ago. And one thing
this is what one of my last guests was talking about. Sorry, Douglas
really?
Rushkoff. He talks about neuroscience. Sorry, continue.
But I mean, one thing that really I've been thinking about a lot is that demonstratively you cannot see and hear the world. We fool ourselves that we do, but this is your consciousness is locked inside your skull. And it has these signals coming from the outside, and there are amazing experiments being done by psychologists and neuroscientists to show that what you think you see is so conditioned by what meaning you put on it, what expectations you have on it, that they can change what they're showing you, but and you won't know because you've already decided that you know what that is. And the pictures we see, the sounds we see are a virtual reconstruction made by our consciousness. And yes, it's definitely, if you do the humiliating exercise of trying to do the most simple concentration meditation, just say, you're just going to put your attention on the one thing you can't stop doing, which is breathing. So if we could stop that, we'd stop that too. And just keep it there. And you just see how quickly you try and see the difference between a stimulus and and an interpretation of that stimulus, that something happens and you go, oh, I know what that is, and immediately you sort it left or right. That's the kind of thing I like, so it's dragging me off in a kind of lost in a kind of daydream direction, or that's the kind of thing I don't like, so I'm grumpy about it and I want it to stop. It's outrageous. And things,
I really like that, the difference between a stimulus and an interpretation of a stimulus. I think that's a huge. It's almost actually brings us back to when we started, when I was asking about looking. Oh, and this is about listening, but actually looking, into each other's eyes, which produces one kind of emotion, and then looking into each other's eyes through screens, which actually, and it's been shown by neuroscientists, it produces something which isn't the same emotion at all as when we're really in front of each other. It's something different, and many of us are as uneducated about that as we are about listening as well. It's so much of, all of us are prone to that, what you just said, believing in the interpretation instead of the actual stimulus.
Absolutely. That we have something in the way our minds are put together, that we want things to mean something, and we can be very, very quick to decide that we know what it means, and that can lead you into some terrible places.
I'm interested in what musical activities are happening at the moment in the monastery.
Well, actually, nothing to speak of at the moment.
Is that a call out to musicians that want to go and visit a Buddhist monastery in Thailand?
Well, it might be a call out to you.
Oh my God! When this madness of pandemic madness comes to an end, that's going to be one of the first places I come to visit, because I really miss it.
I haven't really been doing anything like that lately. I've been doing a bit of audio, more on another side. We've got a massive project right now that, since all the founder teachers of the monastery are dead now, the last of them being Longpo Chiren. You arrived, as I did, in a very fortunate time, which was the end of phase one, the end of the first generation.
Yeah.
That the people who started this place, the last of them is still at the helm. And so we just realized we were in a bit of a kind of spin after he died. There was a bit of an adjustment, because no one had ever really formulated what the tradition of this place is, because you had this, if you were confused, you go and ask him. And it's now dawned on us that we need to do that, and so we're collating loads of old tapes of them talking. We've digitized them all, and some of them sound dreadful.
And there's a necessity to reach out, isn't there? There's a necessity to reach out to the wider world when the founder of any kind of spiritual community or eco-spiritual community, passes. It's up to the followers to keep it going by reaching out to new people to come, right?
I suppose so. Not that we're particularly evangelizing.
Well, no, because that's not what you do.
We need to preserve the thing, though. We need to preserve the core of it, so there is a touchstone, a reference, and it's a massive job.
It's a massive job, isn't it? Because there's so much literature and music, isn't there? But I will be there as soon as I'm physically able. It's always a tricky question on the show that I try to ask all the guests. But what's the connection in your life so far that means the most to you, in terms of something that's continued following you wherever you go? Don't say me. And then,
you.
and you don't have to say, your mother or your partner or something. Oh, you don't have a partner, obviously. You're a monk now, but it doesn't need to be family. Something something that just no matter what you did, it was always going to be with you, which I guess is a bit of a, a burden for a Buddhist monk, because you're not meant to be too connected to anything for too long, are you?
Well, no. I mean, and as I said, as I warned you in talking about these songs, this is very much a thing that a Buddhist monk, particularly, because a monk is the super extreme version of a Buddhist, not trying to balance things, but trying to move in precisely the opposite direction to the way our conditioning and our karma pushes us. Yes, we're absolutely rejecting the tendency to accumulate anything. And we're going to go into Tudong, and one of the purposes of Tudong, one of the highly specific purposes of Tudong is just to say, okay, anything you think you need, you got to carry it. So you very quickly find out what you cannot be without. I suppose, you could be talking about sort of abstract things.
Yes,
as well.
I mean anything, just a connection that I don't know. Maybe in some way, it's a hard thing to ask you, because if I say what's a connection that really defines you, you don't. What your entire life's mission is to not be defined, isn't it?
Precisely, and this is one of the
which I admire hugely in you. Because we come from similar backgrounds and cultures. To be able to take that leap, I think, is incredible. I'm nowhere near in terms of trying to give up defining what I am. But yeah, what would it be?
Well, and neither should you be. I mean, Buddhism is a religion for everybody, not just for monks. And as I said, it's for balancing these tendencies to clutch onto things. And if you've got a working balance, then terrific. I mean, being a monk is like hard training. And I've been in and out. I used it to counterbalance tendencies, excessive tendencies I had. Returned to the world in a state of better equilibrium. Now I'm doing it again. I don't know if I will continue indefinitely or if I'll go back to the world again. And it's okay to have these things. It's just that definitely a lot of misery lies in over-attaching to them. And even like non-corporal things, like we were talking about, theoretical things. It's the sense of constantly trying to construct a network that you say, well, that's me, that is. And that's where we think a lot of suffering comes from. And certainly, hang on, lost my thread a little bit, give me a second. Yes, people get very confused about what the goal of Buddhism is, and frequently we meet Western people coming here thinking that they know what it is already, and that they think it's sort of a part of hippie-ishness. And there are all these assumptions that it's about finding me and finding myself, and terribly surprised to find that it's about scrunching all that up and chucking it in the bin.
I love that.
And
it's about losing yourself, isn't it?
Yeah, just get rid of that, mate. And this thing that people talk about, what are you aiming for? Enlightenment. That's not actually a very good word for what Buddha talked about in the Pali language. He would say either awakening, but that's not defining it, because that's the state you're coming out of. You're coming out of stupor, of sleep. Liberation is a really good word for it, and it's not necessarily to be thought of as this sort of distant city on a cloud that you're going to do all this stuff and like boom, it goes off. Liberation from what? Liberation can be in every second, every time you're able to put something down and say, well, I think that's a part of me, and so I think that now that conditions the way I respond to this, because I hate country music, so I heard a steel guitar, so I'm going to hate that.
The way you describe...
Put that down.
The way you describe liberating is... I don't know, many of us think of freedom as something that we can have. But you talk about it as if it's something that we do.
That's an astute point, I suppose. Yes, and it's certainly not a thing that you can have. As long as you're thinking in terms of accumulating, you won't have freedom because you're enslaved by the need to have these things that you want.
Yes.
And in fact, the liberation lies in being able to put things down, to realize that in any moment there's myriad possibilities of how you could respond, even if not at a physical action level, just how you process something that is occurring. And that this is produced very much by throwing out all these things that we think are a part of ourselves. And if we want to bring this back to connection, because I don't want to be a completely difficult guest and reject everything you say, one of the problems with trying to forge very strong connections with deeply meaningful things that are deeply personal is that they then exclude other things from that kind of degree of connectivity, don't they? If you decide to support a particular football team, it means you're not supporting all of the others.
Yeah.
And so I suppose in that sense, a Buddhist is not trying to look for a team allegiance. It's trying to just go, well, okay, football. It's a good thing. Anyone playing football well, I'm down with that. To take... I don't know why that popped into my head.
So what's the answer? What's the best form of connection?
Well, I suppose the best form of connection, in terms of what I've been saying there, is to be aware of the possibility of connection to anything that comes along. Although that connection doesn't mean accepting everything, not everything is good, but we touched earlier on the incredibly swift transition between perception and strapping a meaning onto it. Just delay that for a bit, and then you could be far more open to seeing what's happening and orientating yourself within it. You can be infinitely connected, though of course I'm speaking from a point of view of where we want to end up. It's a continuous action, as you say, of seeing that you're forming spurious attachments and putting them down, which can be difficult, which can be quite painful, and can be self-deceptive as well, that you're putting it down, and on another level you might be hanging on to the idea of putting something down. I'm a person that can put things down. But certainly there are things, because I'm not a fully enlightened, liberated, awakened person, that definitely seem to run as a thread, and that you see them coming up and go, oh, it's you again, and not just you, Tim.
Well, I think really you are possibly the most super connected person I know, in that you are open to being connected to anything, and anything that you haven't already thought of connecting to. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it, as well?
Well, certainly we're trying to develop... I'm not going to take credit for being very kind, but anything that's good about me, apart from the fact that I'm so handsome, of course, is
most
the
handsome
result.
monk in the world.
Yes, that's DNA. Is a result of following this practice, this teaching, this openness. That certainly isn't something I started with. I used to know very much what the world was about and what I thought about it and what were the things I approved of and the things I didn't. And I'm still bloody opinionated sometimes. It's just I'm trying to not continue, just as soon as something's come out of my mouth, assume that I believe it. Constantly question. Here's you taking a stance, taking a view. Do you believe that? A constant monitoring process to see whether you really believe what you're saying, and that when you say that you do, that's still contingent. That could change in the face of something that will happen in the next second. And I think that's a vital thing we need at a time like this. I mean, I had this very strange experience when I was back in the UK briefly, failing to hook up with you, of arriving on election night. And I was jet lagged, and so I stayed up and I watched the whole thing. And having been out of the loop for a long time and hadn't watched Western TV news and in the thick of this, I missed all the details, and I saw the bigger picture. And I'll tell you what I saw. I saw a load of people saying things that they don't believe. You know, taking a side, clinging to something. Nobody knows how this Brexit thing is going to go. But people have made this emotional choice. I'm on this side, I'm on that side. And the more confusion they have about it, the more they double down. And things coming up like this rabid nationalism. And the left has gone just as mad at the moment as well, clinging to causes which are being framed in religious terms.
Well, it's a unique position for you to be, living a very balanced life, and trying to live a very balanced life in a monastery,
trying to
observing Buddhism, and it's the polarization happening in front of your eyes must look much harsher than it does in front of mine.
Well, it does, and I did a bit of catching up while I was away. I mean, I visited my mum, and she doesn't do much these days, so we watched a lot of TV news. And I mean, yes, certainly that was a strange experience. I think we're at a funny point in history where people are really clinging to old ideas, and expecting, to be rewarded for their faith. It does sound terribly sort of religious and fundamental to me, what I'm hearing. All over the world, and there's something about that view of faith and religion that almost sort of, the more absurd your belief, the more virtuous you are for clinging to it. do you see what I mean?
I do, yes. It feels like a great amount of our insides are being churned out for all to see at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
All of it.
Very much so, and I'm kind of hoping. I don't want to say that. I don't want to be sort of flippant about this current sort of pandemic crisis the world's happening, but I'm kind of hoping that something good will come out of people having to go inside, and as we mentioned earlier, this strange thing of also really looking at the rest of the world, because a lot of people have been saying things about other parts of the world recently which are deeply ignorant and based on I have no idea what. And so, you can. It's almost like the whole world has been sent to its room to think about what it's done, and I'm hoping that they will.
Well, I think that's a really lovely image, actually, and you sent yourself to your own room a while ago. I just hope we all learn as much as you have while we're in our rooms. Peter,
well, for once I was ahead of a fashion curve.
Yeah, Peter, thank you so much for giving your time outside of what I know is quite a grueling schedule over there in the monastery, just to share your wisdom and the wisdom you've learned at a time where we need a lot of it. Peter Radcliffe, monk, mate, and all-round incredible, super connected human being. Thank you.
You flatter me, sir. It's been a pleasure.